Yellowstone's northern range, mid-morning. The air was still, the snow crisp beneath a pale winter sky. From deep within the pines came the long, hollow sound of a wolf's howl, rising and falling with an uneven rhythm. It wasn't the firm, sharp call of territory, nor the rolling chorus of a pack at dusk. This was different, stretched, breaking in places, carrying a thread of something unsettled. The sound reached the ears of a man moving slowly along a frozen trail, his breath visible in the cold. His name was Elias Moreno, a ranger with more than 2 decades in the park, and in all those years he had learned to distinguish the layers of meaning in a wolf's voice. He stopped walking, tilting his head toward the wind, and waited. The call came again. Its tone was urgent but not aggressive. It was a sound meant to be heard, not challenged. Elias shifted his pack, scanning the snow-covered slope where the trees grew thick. A hiker unfamiliar with the land might have dismissed it as background wilderness noise, but to him it was a sign, one that might mark injury, separation, or something else entirely. He began moving toward it, careful with each step, the crust of ice crunching faintly under his boots. The forest ahead was dense, shadows broken by thin strips of light where the sun reached through the branches. The howl sounded again, closer this time. Its pitch edged with a low vibration that seemed to pull the air tighter. Elias paused just long enough to note the change. A distressed animal rarely moved far from its focus, and he knew that closing the distance could mean finding a scene that required immediate care. Every minute mattered if there was an injury. If the wolf were unable to move, exposure alone could claim it in hours. The scent of pine resin hung heavy as he worked his way up a narrow ridge, using his gloved hand to steady himself against the trunks. Snow had gathered in the deep folds of the forest floor, hiding uneven ground beneath. He stopped once more to listen. The howl came again. Longereau, almost unbroken, as if the animal was calling through pain or over something it could not change on its own. The sound carried no challenge. It was a plea. Elias's pace quickened. Through the trees he began to pick out movement, a flash of pale gray fur against the white. The wolf stood rigid, head lifted, the column of her neck taut. Her breath steamed in short bursts. Between each howl she scanned the surrounding forest, ears pricked forward, then pivoted back toward a single direction, her weight shifting uneasily between her front paws. Even from this distance, Elias saw the way her tail was held low, not tucked in fear, but lowered in focus. This was not a wolf advertising her strength. This was a wolf fixed on one thing. He stopped at the edge of her view, not wanting to startle her into retreat. Wolves in distress could flee, even when it meant abandoning what had held them in place, and if she ran, whatever she was guarding would be left exposed. The silence between howls stretched for a moment. Then another sound emerged, faint, muffled, and short, as if something beneath the snow or further down the slope had answered her. Elias's eyes narrowed. That change was important. It meant this wasn't an isolated call. There was a response, however weak, and the two sounds were bound together. The wolf shifted her stance, taking 2 steps forward and then stopping abruptly. Her head dipped slightly, nose to the wind, before she let out another long, trembling call. Elias crouched low, letting his weight rest against a fallen log as he listened. The reply came again, even softer. Whatever was making it was close but hidden, and from the dullness of the sound it was clear it came from below the forest floor or within a depression. If the source was injured or trapped, time was already working against it. Cold and exhaustion could finish what injury had started. Elias steadied his breath, the frost gathering on the edge of his scarf. "Easy now," he said softly, his voice carrying no command, only a quiet reassurance. The wolf's ears twitched at the sound, but she did not back away. Instead, she held her ground, gaze locked toward the unseen place where the weaker sound had come from. The snow lay undisturbed between them. But Elias knew that somewhere just beyond his sight, the reason for her unbroken calls was waiting, and whatever it was, it would not survive this day without help. Elias moved with deliberate care through the dense pines, his boots sinking into the soft crust of snow that had settled overnight. The howls had grown sharper and were spaced closer together, and each one seemed to pull him forward with a little more urgency. He adjusted the strap of his pack, stepped over a fallen branch glazed with ice, and scanned the slope ahead. The forest opened slightly at the base of a rise, revealing a shallow gully where the snow lay smoother, undisturbed by wind. There, framed against the pale drift, stood the wolf. Her fur was thick and gray, flecked with darker strands along her shoulders, the tips of her ears outlined in frost. She held herself perfectly still except for the visible swell and fall of her breath, each exhale cutting into the cold air like a wisp of smoke. Her head was turned slightly toward him, but her eyes didn't linger. They returned almost instantly to a point beyond his view, somewhere down in the shallow cut of the land. She shifted her weight once, claws scraping faintly against the frozen ground, and her tail remained low but straight, a signal of focus rather than submission. Elias stopped at a distance, keeping his posture low, avoiding any movement that might change her stance. He had seen wolves stand watch before, over a den site, over the remains of a hunt, over a pack member. But this felt different. She wasn't circling or pacing. She was anchored to that spot, her legs tense as if every muscle was poised to react. The air between them was quiet except for the faint hiss of wind through pine needles. Then she broke it with another call. This time it was shorter and deeper, her muzzle barely lifting from its forward point. Elias's eyes followed the direction of her focus, tracing the line of the gully. The snow there dipped into a darker patch where the ground dropped just enough to shadow the base. He couldn't see movement, but the line of her body made it clear. Whatever held her attention was close, and she wasn't leaving it. That meant risk. If she stayed in one place for too long, she could become vulnerable, to cold, to injury, or to predators drawn by the sound. If the unseen focus was injured or trapped, its survival window was already narrowing. In sub-zero conditions, even a healthy animal could lose strength quickly. An injured one could fade within hours. He took one slow step forward. Her ears flicked, but she didn't retreat. Instead, her front paws shifted a few inches, angling her stance so that one shoulder now blocked part of the gully's edge from his view. A low, almost inaudible rumble slipped from her throat, not in aggression, but as a warning, a simple statement to keep distance. Elias stopped again, his breath misting in front of him. "Easy," he murmured, the single word soft enough not to echo. The sound of his voice didn't draw her eyes. She was fixed on the gully. The wind shifted slightly, and with it came a faint, irregular sound from below. Not the deep resonance of a howl, but something thinner, muffled. Elias caught it for only a moment before the air stilled again, but it was enough to confirm what he suspected. There was another animal, and it was alive. The wolf's position and repeated calls weren't random. They were tethered to that hidden shape or sound beneath the snow line. Elias stayed in place, calculating his approach. Closing the gap too quickly could push her to bolt, leaving the other vulnerable. Staying too far back risked losing sight of her entirely if she decided to move. Every decision carried weight. In this cold, if the trapped animal could not free itself, time would do the rest. She exhaled again, steam rising from her nostrils, her chest rising sharply as if each breath carried more than the effort to stand. Elias adjusted his grip on his walking pole and began a slow, angled descent toward the gully, careful to keep his steps quiet, the sound of the forest absorbing each movement. The wolf didn't move away, but her tail flicked once, the only sign that she was aware of the space closing between them. Somewhere ahead, beneath the snow and shadow, was the reason she had been calling for hours, and the reason he would not turn back. Elias eased down the slope toward the gully, his boots breaking through the thin crust of snow with muted snaps. The wolf remained where she stood, her muscles taut, her gaze locked on a point in the hollow. The closer he came, the more detail emerged in the snow around her. A weave of tracks pressed deep into the surface, not in the purposeful lines of a trail, but looping, circling, doubling back upon themselves. The prints were clear and fresh, each one softened slightly at the edges by drifting flakes. They formed a rough ring around a single depression, as if she had been pacing its perimeter for hours. He crouched to study them, his gloved fingers brushing the edge of one track where the claw marks cut sharply forward. It told him she had been moving in agitation, not resting. The wind shifted again, and for a moment the only sound was the whisper of needles above. Then, from the base of the depression, a muffled noise rose, short, uneven, and almost lost to the air. It was not the call of a healthy animal. It carried a faint rasp, the sound of breath forced past fatigue. Elias straightened slowly, his eyes searching the narrow shadow where the snow dipped into a darker fold. The wolf's ears pivoted forward, her stance hardening as if to shield whatever lay beyond from him. She let out a low, sustained whine, the kind that carried neither threat nor welcome, only the certainty of presence. Elias stayed still, letting his gaze trace the shallow drop in front of her. The snow here had sagged inward, creating a pocket just deep enough to conceal a smaller animal. Around its rim, the paw prints were closer together, almost overlapping, signs she had been reluctant to step too far from the edge. The faint whimper came again, this time followed by a weak scuff, as though something below had shifted but lacked the strength to rise. The sound's dullness told him it was partially muffled by snow or earth. That meant the trapped animal was in an enclosed space, possibly a small sink or collapsed ground hollow. The risks were immediate. If the space below was narrow and damp, cold air would settle in and drain warmth quickly. Prolonged exposure without movement could lead to hypothermia within hours, and if injury was already present, the window for survival narrowed further. Elias let his eyes meet the wolf's for a moment, reading her stillness. She was not abandoning the spot, but she was not attacking his approach either. That balance was fragile. Any sudden move could break it, sending her away and leaving the other animal to its fate. He shifted his weight slightly, planting his walking pole into the snow for support. "Easy now," he said, barely above a whisper, more to signal his intent than to influence her. The wolf's gaze didn't waver. Her tail flicked once before settling again. She took a single step back from the rim, not in retreat, but in the way of making room while keeping her body angled toward the hollow. Elias took that as permission enough to move closer. He advanced slowly, stopping at the rim of the depression. The snow there was disturbed, the crystals broken and packed from repeated passes of her paws. Beneath the edge, a faint dark opening cut down into the ground, partly veiled by drifted snow. The sound came once more, weak but distinct, a drawn-out exhale with a trembling edge. This close he could make out a pale movement in the shadows below, barely perceptible against the dim light. The animal trapped inside was alive, but whether it could climb out on its own was uncertain. Elias straightened and looked back toward the wolf. Her head was low, her breath steady but quick, as though every call she had given had taken a little more from her. Whatever was below was not just another wolf in passing. Her refusal to leave told him their connection was deeper, and that meant one thing above all. If he failed to act, he would not be watching one life fade in the snow, but two. Elias stepped closer to the edge, placing each boot with care so the crusted snow didn't collapse beneath him. The wolf shifted slightly to the side, still blocking most of the gully but allowing him a narrow line of sight. From this angle, he could see where the snow had sagged into a narrow circular depression, its rim cracked and hardened by repeated weight. In the center, a dark opening cut straight down, no more than a meter wide. The air rising from it was still and cold, carrying with it a faint musk that told him something alive was below. He crouched, steadying himself with one hand against the rim. The snow there gave a soft crunch, exposing frozen soil underneath. The wolf's ears tipped forward, her gaze fixed on him, neither advancing nor retreating, her breath sharp and shallow in the frosted air. From the darkness came a faint, irregular sound, the ragged pull of breath followed by a soft scrape, as if claws had brushed against buried rock. Elias leaned slightly closer, angling his head toward the opening. His eyes adjusted enough to catch movement deep inside, the shape indistinct but clear enough to see the rise and fall of a chest pressed tight against one wall. The animal below was lying awkwardly, one foreleg at an unnatural angle, its fur matted with snow and ice. The confined space made it impossible for it to turn, and every attempt to shift only caused the loose frost around it to collapse further. The depth wasn't great, but the angle of the walls and the frozen layer sealing them made escape on its own unlikely. Any wrong movement from above could send more snow sliding in, reducing what little space the trapped wolf had to breathe. In these conditions, without food or warmth, the animal's strength would fade quickly. If the cold didn't take it first, exhaustion and dehydration would. Elias drew back slightly, glancing at the female above. She lowered her head, emitting a low, sustained whine that didn't rise in pitch, just held steady until it tapered off into silence. It was the same tone she had carried through every howl, an unbroken thread meant to be heard by the one below. He studied the ground around the sinkhole, noting the instability of the rim. Getting close enough to reach down would be risky. Any sudden break could trap him as well or cause injury to the animal. But waiting was not an option. Each minute the wolf remained inside meant another minute of heat lost into the frozen ground. He shifted his pack to the front, unfastening the straps slowly to avoid startling the female. She stayed rooted, her weight pressing slightly toward the hole as though ready to descend herself if she could. The trapped wolf's breathing was slow but uneven, the intervals between each exhale widening. Elias knew he had to maintain a steady approach. Too fast, and he could cause the snow wall to give way. Too slow, and the animal might not last. He took one careful step around the rim, testing the surface with the pole before placing his weight. The ground held, though a fine sheet of ice cracked under his boot. He stopped when he could see more clearly into the hollow. The younger wolf's eyes were half-lidded, its head lifting only slightly at the sound of his movement. Its ears flicked once. But there was no attempt to struggle. "Hold on," Elias said quietly. The words carried more in tone than in meaning. The female above turned her head toward him briefly before returning her focus below. In that small, silent triangle, Ranger, Wolf, and the one trapped beneath, the stakes were plain. If he misjudged the ground, the hollow could close further. If he stepped back now, the cold would finish the rest. He adjusted his footing, drawing in a steady breath, and prepared to make the descent. Elias uncoiled the rope from his pack, the fibers stiff with cold, and anchored it to the trunk of a pine rooted firmly into the slope above the sinkhole. Each movement was slow and measured, the female wolf watching with a stillness that felt almost weighted. She didn't move closer, but her eyes followed his hands as he worked, her ears flicking at the scrape of rope across bark. The hollow below was narrow, the air inside holding a heavier chill than the open forest. The younger wolf lay wedged in the curve of frozen soil and exposed roots, his body half covered by a layer of crusted snow that had likely fallen from above. One hind leg was pinned at an angle between two roots, his fur damp from melting ice. He lifted his head once at the sound of Elias's boots on the rim, but the effort seemed to drain him, and it lowered again without resistance. Elias tested the rope's tension, then eased himself down slowly. Boots braced against the frozen wall to avoid sending loose snow onto the wolf below. The surface flaked away under pressure, small crystals pattering onto the animal's flank. The wolf twitched weakly, his breathing quick and shallow, each exhale clouding the cold air. He didn't try to retreat. There was nowhere to go. The angle of his body told Elias that he hadn't been able to stand for some time. In this position, even if the injury wasn't severe, the cold alone would have been enough to weaken him to the point of collapse. Every passing minute here reduced his chance of walking away. He stopped partway down, one knee pressed against a root for stability, and assessed the space. The trapped leg was caught not by weight but by the angle, wedged tightly enough that the wolf couldn't twist free. The ice around it had hardened, sealing the gap. Elias reached carefully, his gloves brushing against the coarse fur. The wolf flinched at the contact but didn't pull away, his head turning slightly toward the sound of the female's soft, low whine from above. The bond between them was clear, and it was likely the only reason he had not given up entirely. Using his free hand, Elias began breaking the ice around the trapped limb in small, controlled movements, avoiding any sudden shift that could cause the wolf to panic. Each fragment cracked sharply in the confined air before falling away. The wolf's breathing grew more labored with the strain of movement, but his eyes stayed open now, tracking Elias's position. The risk remained constant. A single slip of the rope or collapse of the frozen wall could trap them both. The narrow space allowed no margin for error. When enough ice had been cleared, Elias shifted his position to pull at the root holding the leg in place. It resisted at first, the wood frozen into the soil, but a steady pressure made it give just enough to loosen the wolf's limb. The animal tried to draw it back instinctively, and for a moment the rope creaked as Elias braced against the wall to keep his balance. "Almost there," he murmured, the words low and even. One final push on the root freed the leg and the wolf collapsed fully onto his side, his chest rising fast with the effort. Elias eased the rope through his hands to lower himself the last half-meter, crouching beside the wolf in the narrow space. He reached to lift under the animal's chest, feeling the weight and the slackness in the muscles. Exhaustion more than injury. With one careful movement at a time, he guided the wolf upward, his shoulders straining against the rope as they ascended. Snow crumbled under their boots and paws, but the line held. Above, the female stepped forward, her nose reaching toward them as soon as the younger male's head cleared the rim. Elias pulled them both onto the surface, releasing the tension in the rope only when the wolf's body rested fully on the snow. The female pressed close, her chest against his side, her breath steaming in the cold, and, for the first time since he had arrived, the gully was silent. The younger wolf lay where Elias had placed him, his body sinking slightly into the soft crust of snow. His flanks moved in quick, shallow bursts, steam rising in faint clouds before being carried away by the wind. The female stepped forward without hesitation, closing the space between them in 2 measured strides. Her head lowered until her muzzle touched the fur along his neck, and a low, trembling whine slipped into the cold air. She pressed her body close, angling herself so that her shoulder brushed his, and held that position without movement. The young male didn't lift his head, but his breathing steadied fraction by fraction under her contact. The sound of her whine faded, replaced by the faint rustle of their fur as she shifted to nose at his flank. It was not a search for injury, it was an acknowledgement, a quiet confirmation that he was alive. Elias knelt a short distance away, his gloves resting on his knees. He knew not to break their moment with movement or sound. Wolves did not display relief in ways a human might recognize, but the change in their posture was clear. The tension that had held the female rigid for hours had eased. Her tail now hung in a neutral line, her breathing no longer sharp but deep and even. The younger wolf's paws flexed once against the snow, the toes spreading slightly before relaxing again. It was the first voluntary movement he had made since being freed. Still, the risks remained. His body temperature had dropped, his muscles were stiff from confinement, and there was no certainty he could stand without collapsing again. In this cold, if he failed to walk, he would not survive the night. The female stepped back half a pace and looked down at him, ears forward, eyes steady. She circled once, pressing her flank briefly against his before settling just off to his side. The younger wolf responded by shifting his head toward her, a small but deliberate motion. Elias saw the way his nostrils flared, catching her scent, and the way she lowered her head again to touch his nose with her own. The contact was brief, then she lay beside him, curling her body to fit against his. Her fur overlapped his along the spine, creating a shared band of warmth. This was not idle rest. It was the simplest and most effective way to keep his heat from bleeding into the snow beneath him. Elias watched for another few moments, then adjusted his stance to test whether his presence would disturb them. The female's eyes tracked him, but without the guarded stiffness she had shown earlier. She knew now that he was not a threat. Her attention returned to the young male, who blinked slowly, his gaze drifting between her and the line of trees beyond. The daylight had begun to shift, the shadows lengthening across the gully. Time was thinning, and he would need to move before darkness settled. But for now, this was the first pause in their struggle. The female rose again, nudging his shoulder with her muzzle, a quiet signal to rise. He shifted, forelegs stretching slightly forward before folding back under him. It was not enough to lift him yet, but it was a beginning. She stepped around to face him, her tail giving one slow sweep through the air. Her body blocked the wind, giving him a few more moments of shelter. Elias recognized the pattern. This was not just relief. It was a reassertion of bond, the reestablishing of their pair connection after separation. The younger wolf exhaled once, the sound deep and almost steady. His head tilted toward hers, their noses brushing again in a final silent exchange before she stepped aside. He did not rise, but he no longer lay limp in the snow. The connection between them had been restored, and with it, the will to try. Above them, the wind shifted through the pines, scattering a fine spray of snow that drifted down in slow, uneven patterns, settling quietly over their fur. Elias stepped back, giving the pair space, his boots sinking into the snow with muted crunches. The younger wolf remained on his side, his breathing steadier now but still shallow, each rise of his chest slow to follow the last. The female stayed close, her body curved along his, the thick guard hairs of her coat catching the light snow that had begun to drift down from the overcast sky. She adjusted her position just enough to shield his face from the wind, lowering her head so her muzzle rested lightly against his shoulder. Her ears twitched occasionally at faint sounds in the distance, but she did not move away. The snow beneath them was marked by the patterns of their rescue, dragged impressions where Elias had pulled the younger wolf free, half-melted patches where their heat had already touched the surface. From his position a short distance away, Elias could see the subtle shifts in their breathing, the way the female's flank rose and fell in perfect rhythm with the younger's. That synchrony mattered. It meant he was matching her pace, finding stability in the shared warmth. Without her, his core temperature would continue to drop. Even now, if she left his side for long, the cold would undo what little strength he had regained. Every moment they remained like this improved his chances, but the margin for survival was still narrow. If he could not stand before nightfall, the chill would sink too deep for him to recover in the wild. The forest around them seemed to absorb sound as the snowfall thickened. Flakes landed in the stillness without a whisper, gathering along the edges of the gully and softening the outlines of roots, stones, and tracks. The female closed her eyes briefly, only to lift her head moments later, scanning the trees as if weighing the safety of the place. Her tail shifted against the snow, brushing lightly over the younger's hind legs. He stirred at the touch, a slow, effortful flex of his paws that broke the fine crust around them. Elias noted the movement, small, but a sign that circulation was returning. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of the trees and the faint distant crack of ice settling on a frozen stream. The wolves remained still, the female's breath visible in short plumes. She lowered her head again, touching the younger's neck with the side of her muzzle in a quiet, grounding gesture. His ears flicked weakly in response. The interaction was brief, but it carried the same steadying effect as her body heat. The snow gathered more thickly now along their backs, beading and melting where it met warmth, clinging where it touched the cooler edges of their fur. Elias knew the coming hours would decide the outcome. If the younger wolf regained enough strength to walk, they could move together into denser cover, away from the open gully. If not, they would remain exposed to both the weather and any predators drawn to their scent. The female seemed to sense the weight of that choice. Though she showed it only in the way she held her position without restlessness, her attention shifting between her companion and the surrounding trees. The flurry grew heavier, muffling the view of the ridge above. Elias let the rope coil at his feet, his hands resting on his knees as he watched. There was nothing more to do for now without risking their trust. The female shifted once more, curling herself tighter around the younger wolf until their outlines were one shape against the snow. Together they lay still, framed by the quiet fall of snow, the world around them wrapped in a silence that felt both fragile and enduring. The first light of dawn touched the ridge in a pale wash, spreading slowly across the frozen gully. The snowfall had eased during the night, leaving a fine, unbroken layer over the ground. Elias stood at a distance, his breath visible in the sharp air, watching the two wolves as they began to stir. The female was the first to rise, shaking the snow from her coat in a slow ripple that sent small clumps scattering. She turned to the younger male, lowering her head to nudge his shoulder with measured insistence. He shifted his forelegs forward, paws pressing into the crusted surface, then drew himself upright with a tremor that ran along his frame. For a moment he stood still, testing his balance, head low and ears angled back as if listening to something deep within the forest. They remained close, their bodies brushing as they took the first steps toward the tree line. The female moved slightly ahead, glancing back often, her tail giving short, deliberate movements. The younger male followed in her tracks, his gait uneven at first, but steadying with each pace. Elias watched their progress, noting the faint line of steam rising from their bodies into the morning cold. They paused once at the edge of the gully, the female lifting her head to scan the expanse of white behind them. The younger wolf stood alongside her, his breathing deep, and even now, the strain of the previous day was softened but not erased. The forest beyond was still, the branches holding the weight of the night's snow. As they entered the first line of trees, the light shifted, breaking into thin beams that marked their coats in alternating bands of gray and silver. Their tracks wound behind them in a narrow path, the snow filling in gently at the edges. Each step carried them deeper into cover, where the ground rose in low ridges and the wind lost its edge. The younger wolf moved with more purpose now, matching the female's pace. Elias let his gaze follow them until their forms began to blur between the trunks. He knew the conditions would remain hard, the cold was not easing, and prey would be scarce in these weeks, but together they had a better chance than either would alone. What had been a night balanced between survival and loss was now a measured return to the rhythm of their world. The female glanced back once more, her eyes catching a sliver of light before she turned forward again. The gap between the trees closed behind them until only the faintest flicker of movement was visible. Then even that was gone, replaced by the slow drift of snow from a high branch. The tracks they left were already softening, each print losing its shape under the morning flurry. Soon the gully would hold no trace of their struggle, only the clean sweep of fresh snow and the silence that had followed the last call. Elias remained for a moment longer, the cold settling into the quiet before turning away. Somewhere beyond sight, the wolves were moving deeper into the wild, their path hidden but certain.